Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. It's the final edition of the Roundup for 2022. So glad that you're able to join us today for this live version of our final chat of the year. And we'll be discussing some looks back on what we've done in the past year, what we've learned, some looks forward at what will be happening in a couple of major destinations and source countries with China and the UK. And we'll see what's brewing over the horizon for international education over the next few months. So as we do each week, we take our news stories that we turn into questions here on the Roundup from our SMIE Consulting newsletter called All the SMIE News Fit to Share, and SMIE stands for Social Media and International Education News. And that comes out Monday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern for our email subscribers. And for those of you who are not yet subscribed, you have two different options. I'm going to drop in the link to our subscribe page on our website, smieconsulting.org/subscribe. And the link to the most recent edition that came out this past Monday is available to you. It came out on Christmas, day after Christmas. And then for those of you who prefer to get your international ed news through LinkedIn, we have a version of that newsletter that also comes out Monday mornings, sometime between 8:30 and 9 o'clock each Monday. And those will be regular features of our SMIE Consulting projects. The newsletter and our midweek roundups will continue into 2023. And I want to give a special thank you to one of my employers, University of Nevada, Las Vegas, who I'm a full-time employee with them now, and they've allowed me to continue my work through this newsletter and the roundups. So thanks to the team at UNLV for allowing me to continue this legacy over the last 4.5 years now of coming to you, international educators in the United States and around the world, with our newsletter and our weekly live chats. So thank you again. And I'm glad you're a part of the conversation. So as we do each week, we look at those news stories. We find some themes that percolate to the surface in terms of hot topics that might need us to go a little deeper on. And those were fairly easy to find this week, as we do every year. The news stories in our industry and across the press and in multiple industries focus on year in review and looking forward. And that's what we'll do today with the roundup. So thanks again for watching live. Those of you who I see are part of the live conversation with us. And also thank you to those who are watching on repeat on our YouTube and Facebook channels, as well as maybe hearing the podcast version, the audio-only podcast version. We also wanted to make that available to you, and thanks to the thousands of subscribers to that, those that have taken the time to download the podcast over the last 4 years. So let's get right into our first questions. First question of the day: what were the highlights of 2022 in our industry, international education? And for the purposes of this article, or this question, I'm going to rely heavily on an ICEF Monitor article that came out this past week, called, appropriately enough, What Year in Review, What We Learned in 2022. And it focuses on 4 different areas about the pandemic and the impact on us and lessons we've learned, no going back, capacity questions hit close to home, and the new competitive advantage. And we'll talk about those 4 because I think they do quietly sum up what we've seen over the last year in terms of the impact of global events. And as we say each week, both in our news stories and here on the Roundup, is we have to factor in the impacts of events, the war in Ukraine, what's happened in Afghanistan in the past couple of weeks with the Taliban again banning women from higher education, the impacts those have on our industry, the seemingly unrelated events in terms of the pandemic and reopening in China, and how that's led to an increase in COVID cases and all of the knock-on effects this has. That's also led to the closing of U.S. consulates in China, again, because of the explosion of COVID cases in that country. So everything impacts us in what we do in international education, and it's important for us to always keep our fingers on the pulse on what's going on, and as much as possible try and stay ahead of the curve, as we do with what's in our jobs. jobs, because it is not it's not a static situation in any respect with regard to international education, with regard to world politics, global events, economic rise and fall, economic collapses in some places, currency devaluations. All of these impact our field in one way or another. So it's important that we're aware of what's happening in around us. As we encourage our children to be aware of what's going on in the world around them, we want, in our own work, in our own professions, need to do the same and have awareness of what is happening in the world and how that impacts what we do. So this is my attempt to help my profession understand a little bit better the impacts of some of these global trends that we're seeing. Now, with regard to this ISEF article about the pandemic and the lessons learned in 2022, this in particular, we know the impact it's had on society. It's fundamentally changed the way we live in a lot of places. That in some countries where it wasn't the culture to wear masks, people suddenly started wearing masks because it was the right thing to do to protect our people around us, those that are more susceptible to these kinds of viruses, to help protect them and protect ourselves in the same way. That in some cultures, like in the United States, that was a big problem. We weren't used to that. We don't like being told what to do, but in the end, we did so because it's for the benefit of our communities and those around us and slowing the spread, whatever it might be. But we also learned that we have, as a result of the pandemic, we've had impacts on how we do education and how we recruit even. We know that our campuses have fundamentally changed the way they do education and delivery of coursework. There had already been trends toward online education or having hybrid opportunities for classes that had started even before the pandemic, but the impact of the pandemic certainly accelerated and made permanent some of those changes to delivery of courses that had previously been in person to partially in person, partially online, or fully online. There are full degree programs on our college campuses that have gone fully online as a way for potential cost savings, as a way to reduce overhead. All of these things have happened, and to increase access. And that access is something we'll see again a little bit later on in these recommendations from ISEF in terms of what we've learned. We saw a greater emphasis on diversification as a result of the pandemic. The need to diversify where our students are coming from and the markets that we engage in. The move away from an all eggs in one basket scenario, which saw collapses that were already happening coming from China, and a lot of larger public institutions that have become overly reliant on the Chinese market for international student numbers as well as revenue. And that impact has had downstream effects when you see Chinese students' numbers continuing to drop, but also the impact in China of Chinese students not being able to travel to get to consulates. Now, as we just mentioned earlier, with the relaxing of COVID restrictions, we've seen an explosion of cases in China. How big it has gotten, we won't know, because China doesn't really play well with others in terms of releasing those kind of numbers. So but all the reports on the ground are it's getting worse. So the virus is spreading rapidly there. And that's a combination of factors. It's a combination of not getting the elderly fully vaccinated. It's a combination of also not having the best quality vaccines, that some are only 50% effective, as opposed to the 85-90% effective vaccines that we've had in the U.S. and most of the West. You've seen the impacts of continued lockdowns over the last 30 years that have kept, when you lock down, you don't have contact with regular viruses and bacteria that are in the air, you become less, you have less immunity to those, and you might not get the COVID vaccine or COVID virus because you've kept yourself away from it, or most likely sources of it, for so long. But now your immunity has reduced as a result, and when you go back out into the world, you're much more susceptible because your immunity is lower. And in these Omicron stages and variants that have happened after the initials, you saw the clearly was immune to. Even those that are vaccinated can still get it. We found that out here in the U.S. But you might not get it as severe, which is the only benefit really of getting the vaccine. It doesn't prevent you from getting it. But the challenges have been that these viruses that are now spreading in China are also having knock-on impacts, like locking down consulates from issuing visas because they can't get staff. They don't have the local staff hired or able to work because of again changes to lockdown procedures and employment opportunity or employment requirements that are only being able to be virtual or only working from home. So there's some real impacts moving forward. So we also look at how we recruit more. It's changed, and not just where we recruit, but how, in terms of reliance on a digital suite of tools to help us interact with our prospective student audiences and their parents. We've had the rise of the pandemic combined with the rise of agent aggregators and tech platforms that have begun to dominate how we operate internationally. You see all these impacts really filtering down to all parts of what we do as international educators. You've seen that there is no going back. That was one of the other lessons I think we've seen from this past year. Pre-pandemic ways of doing things just will not work moving forward. They have to be adapted to changing circumstances on the ground in major markets. You have the impact of the online learning piece that we've talked about as well. That is mentioned here, that it's how it's redefining what international ed means. And I think this is something, when we talked about access earlier, that there is an estimated global total of 20 million higher education students and that's in that mix. That is, we know there's about 5.5 million students studying outside their home country right now. So that's 1 in 4 of that global total are currently studying abroad. But for every student who goes abroad, there are another 4 that would like to study outside their home country but can't for various reasons, primarily financial. That could be family commitments as well. They might not have the qualifications or funds to support study abroad. So that the opportunities for more institutions to deliver online education, the versions of transnational education that exist, that are offered by the UK, Australia, other Western nations in other destination markets, either fully online or hybrid or in person in centers or universities overseas. Those models become more important to provide access to an international education, much like we've seen at the secondary school level. We've seen international schools boom over the last 5-10 years. And we know, we had a report about this in India about 3 weeks ago, where we saw that there are now over 700 international schools in India. And that's by exponential growth over the last 15 years. So these international secondary schools are helping to prepare a greater range of students for study abroad. And similarly, some of those, not all of those are going to be able to go abroad. There's over 300,000 students enrolled in India in these international schools, but not all of those are going to be able to go abroad. Some use that as a leg up to get into some of the top Indian universities, or maybe go to a more regional hub institution in, say, Southeast Asia or the Gulf, perhaps. So those capacity questions will hit us as well, and that's another one of the features of the ISEF article that I want to touch on. These capacity issues hit close to home because it can mean a lot of different things. It can mean capacity within individual programs in terms of seats in campuses. It can also talk about the availability of housing. We talked about that a couple weeks ago, last week, about the global housing crisis for international students, where in some countries, we've seen in Holland recently, in the Netherlands, the government has said we're stopping recruitment of additional international students because we don't have the housing for them. We've seen in the UK, in Australia, be significant housing shortages that have led students to actually being told to defer if they can't find housing. Similarly, in Canada, there's now reports that in some universities, Brock University in Ontario is telling students this as well. If you don't have housing, defer. That is a real issue. And we saw in Western Australia, the state government there is actually trying to encourage and will pay residents of Western Australia to house international students if they have an extra room, and the government will pay them money each week to do that. So those are some real capacity issues that we have to manage. And I know at UNLV we're going to be facing a housing shortage, a significant one, if we're going to grow to the extent that we need to grow over the next 5 to 10 years. We don't have the on-campus space right now to grow to the extent we need to at the undergraduate level, and even provide a better range of graduate student housing. So we know that's an issue for us. So that has to be incorporated not just under the international office, that has to be part of the university strategic plan, that to address these issues that are going to be a result of your expanding growth in certain markets. So it's part of what we need to be aware of as international educators, and fight the fight that we need to fight, and raise those issues up the chain, and manage up in terms of expectations with our leadership on campus to help make sure we're on the right page for addressing the needs that we will have given the goals that the institution might have set. And the final one is of the things I think best sums up 2022 is one that ISEF appropriately talks about, is that the new competitive advantage, and that's particularly related to post-study work. And here we're talking about what opportunities will students have in the UK, in Canada, in the US, in Australia, other countries, to work after they're done with their degree. It's been a real hot potato in some countries in terms of how much should we allow international students to have in terms of work permission? How long should they be able to work? Is this a permanent piece of their, should there be a very clear pathway as it might exist in Canada from study to work to permanent residency? Those are the things that we need to be thinking about, and how we position ourselves. And as we always say with U.S. institutions, we need to have that global perspective. How are our competitor countries positioning themselves for work rights for students in terms of pathways from study to work to residency in the various destination markets? Because if you don't think that prospective students from different countries are trying to find out where the best advantage is for them in terms of if that's what they want to do, if they want that post-study work, they're looking for it. In South Asia especially, they want to know what the options are, and having data that you can refer students to about where your students go in different disciplines, international students, for jobs after graduation. What are those salary scales? What are their success rates for OPT to H-1B? That's a little harder for most institutions to track, but are you making that effort? So that's something that we really need to get to. So a lot of neat things in the mix there in terms of what we've learned, I think, in the past 12 months in international education. What I also want to do now is shift gears a little bit to our second question, some of which is impacted with the first one, and that is, will China play well with others, particularly in the West, in 2023? First article is one that raises a lot of eyebrows when we've heard about free speech issues related to China and Chinese students in the United States, depending on both sides of the issue. We've seen students at Purdue University who might have participated in protests against the Chinese government that were threatened by other students, and that is of particular concern. We've seen that what's happened in China with these with the protests against the government, and how that's impacted the larger Chinese diaspora around the world to rise up and feel free to express their opinions and support their family and friends back home who have been living under these lockdowns for 3 years. We've seen that there have been many there have been many issues with visas for Chinese students to go abroad, getting visas in terms of access because of lockdown decisions made over the last 3 years. Those had seemingly been, ironically, they'd seemingly not been an issue in terms of getting the visa, because the visa wait times were very low as opposed to in India where they had been a lot higher before this past 2 or 3 weeks decisions by the government to start lifting lockdown restrictions and the knock-on effect that's had in terms of raised cases of COVID. That's also just led, we've learned this past week, to shutdowns of U.S. consulate operations in China. So for the spring students who are hoping to get back in the spring or to start in the spring, that may be a real challenge if and when the visas consulates will be open to start issuing visas again. If they're returning students, they'll probably fall under the visa waiver program, because that has been extended now through the end of 2023, which is great news. That if a student has already had a visa or is going to be a first-time student visa applicant, but they've had a visa previously as a B or other category visa that has had them go through the security process that often is involved with a lengthy visa interview delays, hopefully that will help free those up. But for new students, that's going to be a real issue in terms of them being able to get to us for classes that start in January in less than a month or 2 months' time. So what are we going to do with that group? So will China play well with the others in 2023? They kind of have to. And I think I shared a story a few weeks ago of what happened at UNLV. Had conversations with Chinese embassy representatives at the Education USA Forum during their global showcase back in August. Left my card with them, said if you're ever looking to come to Vegas, please let me know. We out of the blue in October, I heard from that person saying that our first Deputy Minister for Public Diplomacy wants to visit campus, and we want to come see the campus. We want to help you with partnerships and do all sorts of things that we hope that we can be of service to you. And I told my leadership at the time that I could count on two fingers, the number of times in almost 30 years in the business that I've had an embassy person reach out to me and say they want to visit my campus. It's always the other way around. We want to visit them in D.C. and go to SACM and all the other embassies that have scholarship programs. But this is the first time I've had them, second time, that I've had someone from an embassy say they want to come visit me on my campus. So that was a sign for me, like, oh, something's happening here. Okay, this is good, in a good way. Set up the meetings, and they were there for a few hours, met with all the senior leadership from the president on down, deans and directors and provosts and all levels of the university were in these meetings. And they made very clear that they want to help us grow our footprint with China in terms of students coming to us, in terms of potential faculty exchanges, student exchanges as well. But also thinking about what might be ways we could work together on different things. And that's, for the lack of a better phrase, I've termed it their charm offensive, that they perhaps have realized in the government and now the consulates and embassies here in the U.S. From China that there's been a lot of damage done reputationally to China in the U.S. and that they have to take some proactive measures to kind of gain favor again in the university community, in the governmental community, and they're looking at ways to do that. So it was a eye-opening experience to see that happen, and we're hopeful that this will lead to some productive partnerships and other programs down the way. But I do think that there's an openness now that maybe didn't exist a year or 2 years ago from China to work more closely with those partners in the U.S., whether universities, governments, states, that see value in expanding the relationship, not retracting and othering them, othering each other in terms of how we talk about our relationships. So I think that that's going to be an important piece for all of us moving forward as institutions, that if you're open, show openness to engagement, and you make the right connections, you could potentially see some return and see some new programs, new initiatives, new partnerships with institutions or government agencies in China that you didn't have before, or that maybe had before and and could have lost contact with them, and maybe they can be strengthened again. Because we've experienced higher ed with a great resignation in our industry and multiple industries around the country. We've all experienced that, and there's been a talent loss in our profession, to say the least. And I think what's happened, that's not unique to the United States. I think there are other countries that are grappling with this as well, whether people have left their jobs for various reasons, that they're having trouble filling that talent gap. But there's a need to re-engage, I think, and China, I think, is sensing that. So I think we'll see more of that in 2023. So the answer to that question is, I think, yes. Cautiously optimistic there. Final topic of the day I'll spend some time on is from a colleague of mine, Louise Nickel. She operates out of Southeast Asia, and she is heavily focused on outcomes, on careers for international students that are looking to go home after they're done with their studies. She's British, has a very strong bent on what she does with what's happening in the UK, and she's written a very compelling piece entitled "Is Anyone Listening? International Higher Education is in a Parlous State." Parlous is another way of saying perilous state for the UK in particular. So she makes the case that with what's been happening in the wider world, what's happening in the UK now, that she calls it a parlous state because of the challenges that are impacting institutions post-Brexit. She kind of extends that with the Turing scheme as opposed to what they had been a part of during pre-Brexit with Erasmus Plus, and how that is impacted with their relationship with European universities. She also talks about transnational education, that though the UK is doing phenomenally well in this, the physical transnational education centers that they have around the world are not exactly huge moneymakers for institutions and are fairly cost intensive. So there's a lot of challenges there moving forward. Even though that's something that they do better than anyone else. They don't have it fully on lockdown in terms of their maximizing their return on that. You also have the funding that's been lost at UK universities since Brexit in terms of their domestic funding that has been lost, and the international students that are meant to subsidize, for lack of a better word, their domestic peers. There have been some challenges on immigration in terms of our international students, or should they be counted in the net migration numbers that the British government calculates each year. And there's growing resistance to allowing, because there's been a huge surge in postgraduate students coming to the UK who have also been bringing dependents, and that has led to a little pushback from the current Tory government to potentially limit the numbers that come with dependents who might be attending low quality institutions in the UK. So that put a lot of folks in international ed in the UK on high alert, other than the Russell Group and a few other prestigious institutions that the elites seem to want in Tory government want to push students to. Like Prime Minister Sunak, he said this past week that the UK wants the best and the brightest from around the world. But I think a lot of my fellow international educators in the UK might say he only wants the best and the brightest to go to our top institutions. He doesn't necessarily want the non-best and brightest, however you define that, to come to the UK to study at low-quality institutions, as his Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, had mentioned. So these are the things that I think the UK is grappling with right now in international higher ed. They have an international ed champion that's in the government. They've had different people in that role for the past almost decade now. And you've seen there be a strategic plan that achieved their goal of having 600,000 international students. They achieved that goal 7 years earlier, or 8 or 9 years earlier than expected. The focus now is on leveling up and how that happens. So There's the employability issue, as Louise kind of reflects on, is going to be one of the biggest challenges here. That they have to promote better their students' employment options, not only in the UK, for those that want to take advantage of the 2-year post-study work visa that has been reinitiated the past 3 years, but they also need to help those students that do want to go home, which is right now the greater majority, do want to return to their home countries and find work. And it's a challenge if universities don't have the infrastructure to find those opportunities for their soon-to-be international graduates back in their home countries. So there's a greater infrastructure need there that most institutions across the world don't have. But there are people out there that can help students who are looking to return home and find jobs in their field, which is obviously why they go in the first place, to get their education overseas, is to find a job back home, or if they're not going to stay in country, to go back home and get employment in their field of studies. So as does any international student, as does any student who goes for a university degree. You want that. And Louise does a really good job of laying out all those individual challenges there for UK higher ed. So kudos to her for that well done article. So that's all we have for you today on the Midweek Roundup. We're glad you've been a part of the journey. Thanks so much for watching live. Those of you who are watching on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, or even YouTube Live, really appreciate you being a part of the conversation. I'm looking forward to more of the same in 2023. So until then, have a very happy new year, and we'll see you in 2023. Cheers.